Well, I just started it. We'll both get a copy of it, so that
All
should
right.
be
So 3 seconds of silence, and then I'll start speaking.
okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special stream, which will be, I believe, published on both of our channel. I'm speaking today with Blithering Genius. He is a man with whom I have interacted in the past. He is a fierce critique of the revolutionary phenotype, and it's always good years later to talk to him and see if he has changed his mind on some things and if he can feel the revolutionary phenotype today. How are you doing, Blithering Genius?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. So, how do you want to start this? Perhaps I should just make a general statement about what I think my book is, and then you can say your views on it.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right. So I wrote The Revolutionary Phenotype because I wanted to address a few questions at the intersections of many massive questions of biology that didn't quite have a satisfactory answer, in my view. Looking at the product at the end, what do I believe this theory helps us understand? It is a theory that helps us understand why certain pieces of the phenotype, and by phenotype I mean everything else than the genes, how can they become genes and under which circumstances, and why is it so rare? And ultimately, why do they end up building up genetic code layers? Ultimately, the revolutionary phenotype is a theory of why genetic code layers exist as they are, and why they don't go other ways, why we don't often have events in which some other things than the genes become genes. So ultimately, it's an explanation for the rarity and for the very specific circumstance in which these events happen, which are events ultimately that lead to the first replicator of a branch of living beings to start existing as a replicator. That is what the theory aims at, and along the way, I believe it provides good explanations for why memes shouldn't be considered full-blown Darwinian replicators, why they end up always serving DNA, why things like human culture, religion end up being very pro-reproductive in general on the long term. So I believe that it addresses the questions ranging from the emergence of life, the addition of genetic code layers, and the phenomenon of embedded replicators like memes. So I guess, what is your view on all of this, and how did you approach the revolutionary phenotype?
Well, I approached it as a critic, you could say. So you know who Fathom is, right? Fathom was asking me to read your book, and I said that I was pretty sure that it was, wrong based on what I had heard. But if he wanted to come at me with the ideas, I would debunk them. And we talked, and I think I did that effectively. And I think all the claims in the book, that are substantive are incorrect. So I have a list of them. I wrote a blog post on that. I have a list of all the substantive claims in the book and the criticisms of them, if you want to go through that.
Well, I mean, we've already done this because we have a conversation? I believe we did, right? Back in the days? Or was I just analyzing your discussion with Fathom?
No, we had a discussion, but we may not have gotten into every aspect of the criticisms. We didn't cover everything. We covered some of the main points.
There's no shame in going back. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so phenotypic servitude. That's one concept you have in the book, and I reject that concept. I think it's misleading. It's based on a false assumption that the phenotype is there to replicate the genotype. Your concept of a phenotypic revolution, you claim it's a new type of evolutionary process, and I would say it is just evolution. It's on a special aspect of the phenotype, but it is not something revolutionary. It is not like a new kind of evolution. It is just that a certain aspect of the phenotype, in this case, the medium of inheritance, is selected to be something different than it was. And this creates a new type of being, and that new type of being is then more successful than the parent being or type of being. But this is not something new, like it is not something outside of the theory of evolution. Your concept of phenotypic forgetfulness is not entirely true, especially if you define the phenotype as everything other than the genes, right? Not everything about an organism is encoded in genes. And this is not very important for multicellular life, but it is very important for early forms of life. Your concept of replicators all the way down, I think, is wrong. The printer concept, I think, is very misleading. Your idea that printer genes are selfish, but other genes are not selfish, so your idea of a genotype within the genotype, I think that's also wrong. Your idea that memetics don't exist is completely wrong. That memes don't evolve. They can't evolve to be parasitic on humans. That is wrong. They can, just like bacteria can and viruses can, memes can. Your notion of the relationship between biology and culture is very confused. The phrase genes print memes is absurd. The phenotypic separation theory of sex. Now, I didn't actually read that part very carefully, but
it's a separate theory.
We can set that aside if you'd rather, but that did not make any sense to me.
Okay.
And then this idea that robots or AI will take over us and rule over us like kings or masters, and we'll be the slaves to the robots. This is silly. This is science fiction.
All right.
Memes have already taken us over, but the robots will never do it. The AI will never do it. And we can explore the possibilities of what if we start storing all of our genetic information in computers and then printing zygotes. We could explore that possibility, but it does not lead to this conclusion that you think it does. Okay, so those are my criticisms. That's the list.
Very interesting.
Big list.
Now,
obviously.
I didn't take an extensive list of each point. So what I would like is we go back to the first point, and I'd like to address them one at a time and see what you have to say. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure. So the first one was phenotypic servitude.
Yes. So the principle of phenotypic servitude, which relies on my previous definition of the theory of natural selection. Let's see where you disagree. I read the theory of natural selection. Across generations, replicators occur within restricted environments and produce imperfect copies of themselves. Because the imperfect copies vary across the population, each set of replicators produces phenotypic machines that differ across the population as well. The replicator is able to create machines that favor their own replication, increase in number. The replicators that produce less efficient machines become less numerous. Accordingly, across generations, replicators are served by machines that are increasingly well suited to favor their copying. What do you disagree with this statement?
I think so in a way. What do you define as a replicator?
Anything that makes a copy of itself.
Okay, so a human being is a replicator, right? The phenotype is a replicator.
No, because by make copy of itself, what I mean is that the thing is read and written to another copy.
Okay, so when a human being has a child, is that not creating a copy of itself?
No, because there's nothing that reads the human. There's
What
something
there's
that
nothing that reads
DNA.
the human. Okay, so what happens in reproduction is, as a zygote is produced, right? So you're defining replicator in a way that is specific to genes, which is part of an organism, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is a mechanism that copies genes, and genes are the medium of inheritance for most traits. So that is an important aspect of reproduction, especially for multicellular life forms. For single-celled life, it can be a little bit less important because an entire cell splits, right? Reproduction is not copying the genes of a cell. It is a cell splitting.
I don't care. I'm not defining the word reproduction. I'm defining the word replication.
Well, you define the word replicate. So you're defining replicator as what then?
Replicator is anything that can be read and written to another copy of itself.
So Shakespeare's works are a replicator.
Yes.
Okay. Well,
I mean, if you're uncomfortable with it, can you give me another name? Can we
well,
call
I mean,
them something else?
genes. I mean, we can
Okay,
call genes genes.
I mean, I
you know.
call them queens in the end in my book, so we can call them genes, we can call them queens, but then you'll have to recognize, because you refuse to use the word replicator, that essentially Shakespeare.
I don't refuse to use it. I don't refuse to use it. I just say, if you're going to talk about a replicator, let's talk about what replicates. In the case of a single-cell organism,
what replicates is what is being read and written to another copy of itself that can in turn
okay,
be
so
read
every day, many of your genes are read and written to other copies.
Absolutely.
You are not reproducing unless you have a child.
Yes.
Right?
So there is replication that happens within a generation and replication that happens across generations.
Yeah, but reproduction refers to the phenotype creating a new phenotype.
Yeah, but I haven't used the word reproduction in a single place in this paragraph, so I don't know what's your problem. You want to talk about something else? I want to talk about...
No. You're talking about phenotypic servitude. So you want to create this master-slave relationship between the phenotype and the genes.
Stop attributing intents to me. I was asking you if you agree with my theory of natural selection. You're telling me you disagree with some other words that are not in my paragraph.
Your paragraph had replicator. So I just asked you what the definition of it is, because if you're defining evolution in terms of genes as opposed to the reproduction of the phenotype or the organism, that's where I would disagree, because I think reproduction is the creation of a new life form, and that selection operates on life forms, it does operate on specific genes, but in most cases, the entire life form has to propagate. Right?
You have no disagreement with any single of my words in here. In other words, I will repeat, across generations, replicators occur within restricted environments and produce imperfect copies of themselves. Because the imperfect copies vary across the population, each set of replicators produces phenotypic machines that differ across the population as well. The replicators able to create machines that favor their own replication naturally increase in number. The replicators that produce less efficient machines become less numerous. Accordingly, across generations, replicators are served by machines that are increasingly well suited to favor their copying. You disagree with nothing I've stated?
No, I do disagree with it. I disagree with the way you're using the word replicator and with this concept that the genes, you mean by replicator, you mean genes. And the genotype, right? That's the whole point of
that makes copies of themselves, including genes.
The whole point of the phenotype concept is to distinguish it from the genotype, right?
Yeah.
And to identify the genotype as the medium of inheritance, whereas the phenotype is the form of the organism that does things in the world. And if that form leads to its own reproduction, then it will be selected for.
Yes, now, because which is what my statement states.
No, because your statement says that you make this distinction between replicators and phenotypic machines, which I disagree with, because my point is the phenotype is what replicates. And these phenotypic machines, as you call them, are not produced by the genotype. DNA doesn't do anything.
You're trying to engage
DNA doesn't do anything
with me.
Okay, DNA is an inert molecule. All right? It has to a protein complex copies DNA, transcribes it, maps it to RNA, and maps the RNA to proteins. Right? It's not the genes are not the only thing that replicates. And the genes do not produce phenotypic machines. They are part of the phenotype.
The thing is, you are trying to bring me on other definitions. I'm not interested in your alternative definitions. And if you don't...
Well, I just said I disagree with your definition.
No,
because I disagree with the assumptions
with this definition. That's the beautiful thing in what you're saying. To disagree with this definition, you have to redefine my words.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Definition.
What words did I redefine? What word did I redefine?
What a replicator is.
What word did I redefine?
Something that gets read and written to some other copy of itself. Does the protein get read and written to something else?
No, the DNA gets read and written to another copy of the DNA.
Okay, so can we have a word for this?
Yeah, it's DNA or genes. That's what genes
Okay.
means. It means the information content of the DNA molecule.
So let's call them genes instead of replicators. Do
Okay.
you agree, if you change the word replicator in all of my paragraphs, that you agree with all statements? Instead
No,
of saying
I already
replicator, you say genes.
no, because as I said, the genes do not produce phenotypic machines. They don't do anything. They are simply information. The protein complexes in a cell will, a phenotypic machine creates new phenotypic machines. Okay, a reproducing machine reproduces. I can give you a petri dish with the entire human genome in it and say, oh, look at these genes. What are they going to do? Nothing. Are they going to copy themselves? Are they going to produce phenotypic machines to be their slaves? No.
You're the one bringing all these subjects, slaves.
I'm bringing up biology. This is biology.
No.
This is how biology works.
Let's go back to what you just said.
It is not your concept of replicator, which is genes creating phenotypic machines. They do not do that.
You say genes do not produce phenotypic machines.
That is correct. They do not.
Is the hemoglobin gene necessary for the hemoglobin protein to appear in the universe?
Yes, it is. So is the protein complex.
That's what I call produce. Necessary for the emergence of.
Okay, so produce means encodes for, contains the information of. Yeah. It doesn't produce it. It contains the information necessary to create the hemoglobin protein, right?
Okay, so now we change the word replicator for gene and produce for encode. Do we then agree with the statements in this paragraph? Do you realize we've spent 20 fucking minutes?
Yeah, this matters. This matters. This is the crux of it.
So that you could accept the truth right in front of you.
No, I'm not accepting
words.
No, this is bullshit, dude. You're full of shit. Okay, you don't know what you're talking about. You're using these bullshit metaphors to cover up chemistry. Whatever. All right, let me explain the backstory to this. Back in 2018, Fathom came to my Discord server, and he was trying to get me to read The Revolutionary Phenotype, but I had no interest in reading it because I had seen JF's tweets about it and I knew that it was bullshit. But I told him that if he was willing to present the ideas in real time in a voice discussion, then I would shoot them down in real time. We had that discussion, I think it was back in December 2018, and that is posted on my channel. Okay, so if you're interested, you can go check that out. It was a good discussion, and it was a friendly discussion. We got into the details, and I did what I said I was going to do. I shot down the ideas as Fathom presented them. I explained how they are based on misleading metaphors and false assumptions about biology and evolution. Okay, so that was the beginning of this. Then JF listened to that discussion, I guess. Maybe he didn't listen very carefully to it. And he contacted me on Twitter and he said, would I be willing to go in the public space and debate it with him? And I agreed to that, and so I went on the public space and we had a debate. And he did pretty much the same thing he did this time, only it was much more, it was less confrontational. Partly because I was being more diplomatic, I guess, and maybe for some other reason, I don't know. But I presented the counter-arguments, and JF really didn't have any responses to them. He didn't have any rebuttals. All he really had was this, well, he had two things, I guess. One is that he was saying I was just complaining about the language or the metaphors and not the ideas. And that is false. And also I would say that if you disagree about ideas, you're going to disagree about metaphors and language, right? You could disagree about language without disagreeing about ideas. You could say, well, I don't like the language you're using here. I think it's confusing or it's inappropriate, but I agree with the underlying ideas. You could say that. And JF tried to pretend that that was my position, that I didn't really disagree with the ideas. But language conveys ideas, right? And it often does that through metaphors. metaphors are very important for understanding because it's hard for most people to think abstractly about something. And to do that, they rely on metaphors that map this more abstract thing or more like unfamiliar thing to something that is less abstract and more familiar to them. And there's nothing wrong with metaphors. We need them. They're kind of necessary. You could even argue in a sense that all of language and all of thought is based on metaphors, although, that gets into a whole other discussion. But certainly I do not disagree with the use of metaphors. However, metaphors can be misleading. Like the way evolution is often presented to people as a ladder of progress is a metaphor, and it can convey some aspect of evolution to people, like the notion of incremental changes from one form to another. But it can also be misleading because it seems to imply that evolution is going somewhere, that it has some kind of telos, purpose, or end point, and it also trims away all the branches. So it presents evolution as a series of changes rather than a more accurate metaphor would be a branching tree that generates many different branches. But even that metaphor has to be, fleshed out, and then fleshing it out is another metaphor, right? So we have to use metaphors, but that doesn't mean that metaphors are always correct. You can have an incorrect metaphor because it conveys an incorrect idea. And the core false metaphor that J.F. relies on and that his entire theory is based on is this notion of the gene as a kind of agent that has purpose and that controls the organism, and that is basically the locus of purpose and control in biology. J.F. seems to believe that the genotype is where purpose resides, and also that the genotype does things, or that genes do things, that they are like active agents that create phenotypic machines, as he calls it, or in other words, that construct the phenotype to serve their interests. And so this metaphor implies that they have independent interests and that they are active, that they are sort of like agents, that genes do things. And this is not true, and this is a very misleading metaphor. I'm going to read part of the book that contains some of this metaphorical language, and I'll show how it's misleading. Thus, we can now answer the question of the origin of life on Earth. The answer is quite simple, but shocking. DNA-based life was created by another life form. It was somewhat of an accident. After the initial accident, DNA became so aggressive that it destroyed its creators by outcompeting them. It killed them, ate them, and gruesomely recycled them into building blocks that it then reused to produce its own organisms. We are the direct descendants of the DNA-based organisms that undertook this cannibalistic genocide. All right, so that's a paragraph in the book. And so J.F. is claiming that he has this profound new knowledge that answers the question of the origin of life on Earth. All right, this is ridiculous hyperbole, obviously, because J.F. has no answers to anything. He says DNA-based life was created by another life form. Now what he's referring to here is the evolution of DNA as a storage medium and a medium of inheritance. Okay, because that's what DNA is. It's a storage medium. It stores information about how to create proteins and also information about how to create transfer RNA molecules, and also some information about how to sequence these operations, I don't want to get into all the details, but basically DNA is a repository of information, and it is copied during cell division. Okay, so it is part of reproduction. However, the first point I will make is that cell division copies an entire cell, or you might say it creates a new cell of the same type, right? And reproduction creates a new organism of the same type.
So we should not confuse reproduction with simply copying DNA. Copying DNA is part of that process, and it is an important part. And it's sometimes useful to think about what you inherit from your parents as DNA, because the information stored in DNA determines all kinds of properties of you that exist at the macro level. So a difference in genes produces a difference in hair color, or intelligence, or height, and differences in genes make us different from other animals. So genes are very important, but that doesn't mean that that is the only thing that matters, or that that is the purpose of life, is to copy the genes. Okay, or that reproduction is just copying genes, or that we are selected to copy our genes. And I'm going to explain later why those statements are all misleading. But first, let's go through this paragraph to look at the metaphors in it and how misleading they are. So he says DNA-based life was created by another life form. This is really weird language, because it would be better described as DNA evolved as a storage medium, or the use of DNA as a storage medium evolved. What happened, presumably, we think, and not just JF, but many people believe this, that at some point in the past, RNA was the storage medium for information. And we believe this because RNA plays a more direct role in catalyzing proteins. And so it's reasonable to assume that this function evolved first, and then later the storage of the same information in DNA evolved as a separate evolutionary step. Okay, so a lot of people believe this, that there was what you might call RNA-based life, although it wasn't based on RNA, it just used RNA. I mean, it was, you could say carbon-based, water-based, whatever, right? Like, even the word based is a bit misleading. But anyway, we had, at some point, perhaps this earlier stage of life in which RNA was the medium of inheritance, and then by some mutation, life forms were created that stored information in DNA. And the exact sequence of evolutionary steps by which this happened, I don't know. And I'm not going to get into it, and JF doesn't know either. But at some point, this evolved. Now, was this the creation of DNA by another life form? Well, not really. It was the creation of a new biochemical pathway by evolution, not by another life form. There was no agency involved. There was no, like it happened by a mutation that was then selected for. So it was not RNA that created DNA as a storage medium or whatever. It was evolution that selected this to exist. Okay. Now, of course, the molecules of RNA were probably involved in one way or another, but that doesn't mean that they were doing something. It doesn't mean they created DNA. That would be a misleading way of putting it. You could flesh it out and explain in what sense you mean created it. But if you do that, you're going to take away a lot of the power of this narrative, because the narrative depends on anthropomorphizing these molecules. Right? DNA and RNA are just types of molecules. They don't actually do anything. Like, types of molecules don't do anything, and specific individual molecules of RNA and DNA don't actually do anything, even in a cell. If you want to think of a type of molecule as actually doing something, it would make more sense to say proteins do things, because proteins actually do work. They can convert energy into work. They can assemble other molecules, catalyze reactions and use energy to catalyze reactions. I don't think RNA does that by itself. I think it requires proteins to work, and I think RNA is basically just a template, as DNA is just a template. But anyway, to describe this event, the evolution of DNA as a storage medium as RNA creating it really doesn't make sense. And then JF says it was somewhat of an accident. Well, even just saying that shows a kind of ignorance or confusion about evolution, because everything that happens in evolution begins as an accident. Well, not even an accident, just as a mutation, right? If you say accident, it implies that there was some intention which then didn't, was violated. Like you wanted to do X, but instead Y happened. You wanted to drive to the store, but instead you ran into a telephone pole or something like that, right? That's an accident. But we're not talking about things with intentions or agency or even purpose. We're talking about a mutation occurring. And then once the mutation occurred, it was selected for. Okay? And then what JF says here is after the initial accident, DNA became so aggressive that it destroyed its creators by outcompeting them. I think here he's just describing evolution, that life forms that were using DNA as a storage medium outcompeted life forms that did not use it, and so replaced them. And this is how evolution works, right? Some new mutation comes along, it works better than the previous form, makes a form more effective at reproducing, and so the new form replaces the old form, right? And we often use the language of competition in biology, like we talk about competing traits or competing species or competing populations, and people often incorrectly take that metaphor to mean that genes or species or populations have a kind of purpose and they have a kind of organization and they work together in the way that human societies can fight each other in a war. But that's not what competition means in that metaphor. All it means is that one will increase at the other's expense, or one will increase causing the other to decrease. It doesn't mean that they're organized or that they have some raison d'etre or anything like that. And it doesn't mean that one team is fighting the other team. It doesn't mean that. You can have a lawn and you can have clover and grass in the lawn, and you could say that clover and grass are competing for nutrients, for water, sunshine, and so on in the lawn. This doesn't mean that the clover is working as a unit against the grass. Every grass plant competes with its neighboring grass plants and clover plants, and every clover plant as an individual competes with the other clover plants and grass plants around it. And when we say they're competing, this is just a metaphor to describe the way things are selected, right? That with all these individuals competing against each other in a certain environment, we might get an increase in members of one type and a decrease in members of the other. And we can talk about these types competing, but we shouldn't confuse that with some kind of, with thinking that the types have a purpose, that species have a purpose, and that they're fighting a war against another species, or whatever. We should not think of it that way. It's just a metaphor used to describe the dynamics of population evolution, basically population dynamics. Anyway, I have a blog post on that, and also an article which is in the book that I put out on Amazon recently, which goes into more detail about competition and balance in nature. So do not be misled by these metaphors. Many people are. They think that species are fighting each other, or races are fighting each other, or genes are fighting each other. No, this is all wrong. None of that is happening. It's just a metaphor to describe population dynamics. Okay, really what's happening is individual organisms are competing for resources, right? So let's say in this early environment, you had DNA, I'll just say based, even though it's not a great way of describing it. You had DNA-based life and RNA-based life, and they're just little bubbles of chemicals, right, that absorb certain food molecules from the environment and use them to carry out their metabolism and grow and split, okay? Both of these types of bubbles use the same nutrients, so if you have them next to each other, then there's a kind of competition, which is that they make the environment worse for each other. Well, that's true of any type. The DNA next to the two DNA-based life forms next to each other will make the environment worse for each other. two RNA-based life forms next to each other will make the environment worse for each other, and a DNA-based life form and an RNA-based life form next to each other will also make the environment worse for each other. So organisms, by existing in the environment, compete for finite resources, and they compete with everyone around them. Not just with members of the other type, but with every other individual in their neighborhood. But the net effect is that one type might increase in numbers at the expense of the other, because it might be better at winning competitions. So when an RNA organism is next to a DNA organism, maybe 60% of the time the RNA organism dies and the DNA organism grows and divides. Okay, if that's the case, if DNA has some kind of advantage in that environment, then those organisms will increase and the RNA-based organisms will decrease in numbers. All right, so that's all that happens there. It doesn't mean they're fighting a war or something like that. And also, DNA and RNA are just types of molecules that are present in every cell pretty much that exists, okay, with a few exceptions. Like, I think red blood cells might have RNA, but they don't have DNA when they become mature or something. I don't know. But basically, DNA and RNA are present in almost all cells and all living beings, so it's not clear how DNA won, right? If it was fighting a competition against RNA, like, what does this mean? Both of these molecules are in all life forms, other than, viruses or whatever. But basically, every cellular life form has DNA and RNA in it. So how did one win and the other lose? Well, what does that mean? Well, to JF, because DNA is the medium of inheritance, this somehow means that DNA won and that RNA serves DNA. But this makes no sense. Okay. Anyway, so he said it became aggressive. Well, he's just describing selection, right? All life forms are aggressive in the sense that they need resources to reproduce, and they are selected to reproduce. And when you get a new type of organism that is better at surviving and reproducing, then it will often replace the parent type. This is just evolution. He says it killed them, ate them, and gruesomely recycled them into building blocks that it then reused to produce its own organisms. What does that even mean? DNA killed RNA, or DNA organisms killed RNA organisms? I don't even know what this is supposed to mean. Gruesomely recycled them. What does that mean? I don't know. It's gibberish, right? It's gibberish. Does he mean it recycled RNA because RNA still exists in a cell? So you have to have his assumptions about purpose. You have to believe that the medium of inheritance is where purpose resides. And JF seems to believe that purpose resides in the medium of inheritance because mutations to the medium of inheritance can be inherited and selected for. But how does that mean they have purpose? Or that's where purpose is and everything else serves the medium of inheritance? This really doesn't make sense. Anyway, and then he says we are the direct descendants of the DNA-based organisms that undertook this cannibalistic genocide. Well, this is ridiculous rhetoric. I mean, it's just like, bad science writing. You could say evolution is a cannibalistic genocide, but that's just evolution. Evolution is life forms competing for finite resources, and some are selected for and others are selected against. So evolution proceeds by genocide. So you're not adding anything here. All of this verbiage could be replaced by a single sentence. At some point in the history of life, the use of DNA as a storage medium evolved and replaced an earlier form of life in which RNA was the storage medium. That's the biologically accurate description. But that doesn't work as a story, right? And if you just described it that way, then this whole book, like the whole premise of this book is destroyed. All the ideas in this book rest on this false notion that purpose resides in the medium of inheritance, and this analogy to something that never really happened, this analogy, like he's analogizing what's going on now to what happened in the distant past, but his view of the distant past is based on these misleading metaphors. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what JF actually is doing. Okay. JF is a charlatan. And what charlatans do is they sell fake knowledge. There is a huge demand for fake knowledge because it is easier to acquire than real knowledge, and it can be made much more appealing than real knowledge. Acquiring real knowledge requires effort, intelligence, and it is often hard to accept. And let me explain this. Like, think about it this way. The reason that ordinary people don't understand evolution is because it is hard to understand, it's counterintuitive, it requires abstract thinking, it requires a certain amount of intelligence, and it conflicts with their moral assumptions. And that's why people don't understand evolution. And there are lots of things like that. Any knowledge that the ordinary person doesn't already have is going to be hard to acquire or not very appealing, right? And it might not be appealing because it's sort of uninteresting or whatever, or it might not be appealing because it conflicts with myths, false beliefs, narratives, ideologies, and so on. It could also be not appealing because it exposes philosophical problems, or it makes you think. People don't really like to think. It might open up a Pandora's box of other questions and problems. And knowledge of evolution does that. So most people don't understand evolution. But there's a market for fake knowledge because fake knowledge can be made much more appealing and easy to learn. If you abandon the goal of truth, now you have more freedom to construct ideas that fit people's preconceptions, that are intuitive, and that are easy to understand. So if you abandon the truth, then you can tell a story that the ordinary person is going to find more appealing, more understandable than the truth. And that's the problem. And that's why there's a huge demand for fake knowledge. Right? You see it all over the internet. The internet is just full of fake knowledge. Deepak Chopra or 12 Rules for Life or, whatever. There's all kinds of crap out there. And all of this crap is selected to basically appeal to people who are kind of lazy and stupid. To, be blunt about it, right? Kind of lazy, kind of stupid. They don't want to think, they're not that motivated to really seek the truth. They want simple, easy answers that that appeal to them emotionally, right? That fit their preconceptions, that fit their intuitions, and typically that tell them that they are good and somebody else is bad. That's why people like conspiracy theories, that's why they like ideologies, and that's why they like fake knowledge. And the typical charlatan, the typical scientific charlatan, does something like this. He generates something that to an ordinary person is indistinguishable from real science. This is pseudoscience, okay? This is real pseudoscience. The left uses that term to label things they don't like, but there is a legitimate use of pseudoscience, which is fake science. And fake science is verbiage that looks like scientific writing. It's something that looks science-y, but it's not describing reality. It's not real knowledge. It doesn't have predictive or explanatory power. It's all garbage, but it works on the ordinary person because they don't have the ability or the desire to critically evaluate it. They just want to believe that they're in on a big secret, right? They want to believe that they've seen through the matrix. They have some secret truth that makes them superior to other people. There's a huge demand for that kind of thing, for some kind of special knowledge, whether it's, weird crystals, like New Agey shit, or, the right wing has their own version of this, which is like esoteric mumbo-jumbo about, Indo-European religions or whatever, or, it could be quantum theory. Everybody loves to tell bullshit about quantum theory, although they don't know anything about it, right? So like, there's all this fake knowledge out there, and this is just another example, and it's pretty blatant to me, and that's how I knew immediately that this was bullshit. Okay, like, because my bullshit detector goes off, and then this idea that he's talking about is clearly based on a misconception, and it's really obvious what the misconception is. So that's why I knew right away that this was bullshit, and I didn't need to read it to debate Fathom. But I did read the book before I went on the public space. Okay, and even though I knew it was bullshit, I was amazed at how bad it was. I couldn't believe how shitty that book is. It is literally the worst book I have ever read in my life. Okay, so I do bear a kind of grudge against JF just because I fucking hated that book so much. Every fucking paragraph, I wanted to puke, right? Like, reading that paragraph that I just read, I wanted to fucking puke. Okay, because it's just sickening. It's just bullshit, and it's just ridiculous bullshit, and it pisses me off because I like science. I like real knowledge. And seeing this crap being peddled as science or knowledge just annoys me. All right, but anyway, that's how this happened. I never had any interest in the revolutionary phenotype, but because I went to all this effort of reading the fucking book and debating JF and debating Fathom, I wrote up a blog post debunking it, and I made a video where I went through that blog post and I debunked it thoroughly. So if you want to know the details, like the detailed debunking, you should go to that video or read that blog post. And maybe I'll link to one of those, probably the video, and you can go look at the blog post from there. All right, so that's how this started, and I was going to append to this a discussion of the genocentric view versus the organism, or you could say phenocentric view, and why the phenocentric view is correct and the genocentric view is incorrect. But I think I will leave that for another time because I have already rambled quite a bit. So, I guess I forgot to mention how this recent debate came up. So, I went on the public space in 2019, and then I put up the blog post about it, and then I didn't really, think about it or pay any attention to JF since then. But then this guy came to my Discord server a few weeks ago, and he wanted to talk to me. Well, he came to me in private. He wanted to talk in private about the revolutionary phenotype. He said he thought I was, somewhat wrong, but JF was also somewhat wrong. He didn't really explain what he believed. I think he was sort of a racialist. So he really wanted to defend a racialist position against both of us. But anyway, he wanted to debate me. So I said, fine, so let's set up a time. So we set up a time to debate, and then he backed out. Okay, so I said, all right, whatever. And then we were talking some more in DMs, and he said, I wish your discussion with JF was still up. I feel like he could defend his ideas better than I could. And I said, well, you could ask him to debate me, but I don't think he'd do it. And then after me saying that, JF came to my Discord server, and we set up a time to have a discussion. But JF did not come prepared to discuss my criticisms. He didn't have them open in front of him. He didn't seem to know what they were, and he had no rebuttals to them. And not only that, he was not even prepared to have a discussion about theoretical biology. And as soon as I tried to get into the actual theoretical biology, he rage quit. Right? He rage quit because I was focusing on the actual theoretical issues, and I wouldn't accept his ridiculous definition of evolution, his own personal retarded definition of evolution, which contains his notion of phenotypic servitude and his notion that the genes create phenotypic machines that then serve them and all this other crap, right? And I reject all of that stuff. That's the crux of the debate. So obviously I'm not going to accept his retarded definition. right? That's where the debate lies. It's in that, it's in my rejection of that definition. That's where the debate lies. So he does not want to get into that debate. If somebody else does, if somebody wants to debate me about theoretical biology and its relation to other things or whatever, that's fine, but come prepared to debate me. And JF should have known what this was going to be about. Okay, he knows who I am. My criticisms have been out there for more than 2 years now, and we've debated before. I think some people might think I ambushed him or something, like he thought I was a friendly person and then I was unfriendly or whatever. No, he should have known this was going to be a debate, and he had all the necessary information. He could have read through my criticisms one by one. They're neatly itemized. He could have gone through them and prepared a rebuttal for each one, or he could have said, you know what, I concede these points. Those were his options. But instead, he chose to not get into the actual debate, right? To try and weasel out of it, using this ridiculous debating tactic of getting me to agree to a false definition that I don't agree with. And then when I refuse to play his fucking game, he bails on the discussion. So if you needed more evidence that JF is a charlatan, there you go. So yeah, that's how this happened. And maybe later I will do a separate discussion of the genocentric versus the phenocentric views. All right, as always, thanks for listening.